The cameras were rolling, the audience was buzzing, and the atmosphere inside the View studio felt heavier than usual. You could almost sense it in the air before the first word was spoken, as if everyone in the room already knew something unusual was about to happen. Robert De Niro, a man whose very name commanded respect across Hollywood, had arrived to promote his latest film. But this wasn't going to be the typical celebrity interview, the kind filled with polite laughter, scripted questions, and predictable sound bites. No, this was the moment when one of Hollywood's most respected actors would finally reach his breaking point on live television. And none of the millions watching at home were prepared for what they were about to witness. The legendary actor entered the studio with that unmistakable presence that had defined his career for decades. Even at 78 years old, he carried himself with the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. The audience erupted in applause, thrilled to see a living legend in their midst. But while most saw the familiar smile and polite wave, those who were paying closer attention noticed something else. His eyes. There was a hardness in them, a tension that hinted at frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The hosts welcomed him warmly, but one in particular was practically licking her chops before the first question even began. Joy Behar, known for her sharp tongue, her confrontational style, and her eagerness to stir the pot, was already leaning forward with that familiar smirk. The producers had briefed her, of course, and she knew exactly where she wanted to steer the conversation. Robert's team had requested very clearly that the focus remain on the film. But Joy had other plans, and she made them known right away. "So, Bobby," she began casually, deliberately ignoring the fact that Robert had specifically asked to be called by his proper name during the pre-interview briefing, "I have to ask about your recent comments regarding the political climate. Some people are saying you've become a bit too outspoken for an actor." That one word, Bobby, landed like a stone thrown across glass. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His publicist, sitting just off camera, shifted nervously in her chair, recognizing immediately that this was not the agreed-upon line of questioning. The moment was subtle, but for Robert, it was the first spark to ignite what would become an inferno. "Well, Joy," he replied slowly, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I think actors have every right to express their opinions like any other American citizen. We're not just dancing monkeys here for entertainment." The audience chuckled lightly, unsure whether to laugh or to brace themselves. And if Robert's answer had been left to stand, perhaps the moment would have passed. But Joy Behar was not about to let it slide. "Oh, come on," she interrupted with that antagonistic gleam in her eyes. "Don't you think there's a difference between having an opinion and using your platform to influence people who might not be as, let's say, informed as you are?" The condescension was thick in her voice. She leaned back in her chair with a kind of smug confidence that only comes from years of being able to push guests into corners on live TV. But Robert De Niro was not just any guest. "Informed," he repeated slowly, his famous intensity starting to shine through. "Are you suggesting that regular Americans can't think for themselves? That they need to be protected from hearing different viewpoints?" His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, began to clench slightly. The tension in his shoulders was becoming visible now. Joy laughed dismissively, a sharp sound that sliced through the studio like nails across a chalkboard. "I'm just saying that when someone like you speaks, people listen. Maybe you should be more careful about what you're putting out there." "More careful," Robert said, his voice dropping into that dangerously quiet tone that anyone who'd watched his movies would recognize as a warning sign. "Let me ask you something, Joy. How long have you been telling people what to think on this show?" The studio went silent. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. Whoopi Goldberg, always the veteran peacemaker, tried to jump in with a light-hearted comment to break the tension, but Joy was locked in. She wasn't backing down. "I've been in this business for decades, Bobby," she shot back, once again refusing to use his name properly. "I think I know a thing or two about responsibility." The shift was subtle, but it was there. Robert leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice sharpening. "It's Robert," he said firmly. "And responsibility? You want to talk about responsibility?" Let's talk about the responsibility of journalists to actually ask real questions instead of setting up gotcha moments for their own agenda. Joy's face flushed red. She wasn't used to this. Most celebrities, when pushed, would back off. They'd smile politely, dodge the question, maybe throw in a self-deprecating joke to lighten the mood. That was the game. But Robert wasn't playing by those rules. He was pushing back, harder. "I think you're being a little dramatic," she said, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to keep control of the conversation. "This is just a conversation." "No," Robert shot back, his voice rising just enough to cut through the silence. "This isn't a conversation. A conversation implies two people actually listening to each other. What you're doing is trying to create a soundbite that makes me look bad, so you can feel superior." The audience froze. You could practically hear a pin drop. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I think you need to calm down," Joy said finally, her tone shifting into that patronizing voice that had grated on countless guests over the years. And that was it. The words that would become the tipping point. Robert's eyes flashed with a dangerous spark, the kind of look that fans had seen in countless roles, but now realized was not a performance. It was real. "Calm down," he repeated, his voice carrying that icy edge. "You bring me here under false pretenses, ambush me with loaded questions, disrespect me by calling me the wrong name repeatedly, and then you tell me to calm down when I call you out on your behavior?" The tension snapped like a wire stretched too far. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted entirely. This was no longer an interview. This was a showdown. And what happened next would go down in daytime television history. So tell me, what do you think triggered Robert Dyro's breaking point? Was it the constant disrespect, the ambush-style questioning, or simply years of pent-up frustration finally boiling over? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because we're just getting started, and the next few minutes would transform a routine promotional interview into one of the most unforgettable explosions ever broadcast on live TV. The studio lights burned hot overhead, but the tension in that room was even hotter. The audience sat silently, still processing what they had just witnessed in part one. Robert Dyro, the man Hollywood hailed as a legend of dignity and restraint, had already begun to unravel. His carefully constructed mask had cracked, and now the fragments were scattering across the floor for millions to see. But what happened next would take this moment from shocking to unforgettable. The host, visibly shaken, tried to regain control. You could almost hear the producers in his earpiece, urging him to steady the ship before it capsized live on air. He leaned forward, forced a smile, and asked Robert a question he thought might calm the storm. But it was the wrong question, at the wrong time. And in that instant, Robert's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and he decided he wasn't holding back anymore. "Do you have any idea what it's like," Robert snapped, his voice cracking like thunder, "to spend 40 years giving everything you have, only for people like you to sit here and reduce it to gossip? To cheap soundbites?" His words weren't rehearsed. They came from the deepest parts of a man who had been holding back a lifetime of frustration. The crowd gasped, some even cheering, unsure if they were watching a meltdown or a moment of truth. The host attempted to pivot, but Robert wasn't letting him. He rose halfway out of his chair, leaning forward, every muscle in his body trembling with rage. His hands gripped the armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. And then, for the first time in his career, Robert spoke words no one expected to hear from him. "You think you know me? You think you know Robert Dyro? You don't know a damn thing. None of you do." The studio froze. Cameras zoomed in. Audience members exchanged nervous glances. And those watching at home leaned closer to their screens, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing something raw, unfiltered, and historic. Robert's rant wasn't just about Hollywood. It wasn't about the films, the fame, or the fortune.
It was about respect. It was about dignity.
It was about being used up by an industry that demands everything and gives nothing back but shallow praise. He spoke of sleepless nights on set, the physical toll of decades of work, and the emotional scars left behind by betrayal, rumors, and broken promises. Every premiere, every interview, every so-called celebration, he continued, his voice shaking, is just another mask they make you wear. And I wore them all because that's what you have to do. You smile. You nod,
You give them what they want.
but you lose yourself piece by piece until there's nothing left. Nothing but the puppet they created. At this point, the audience was torn. Some were clearly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, not sure if they were witnessing the end of a career. Others were mesmerized, clapping and shouting encouragement, as if Robert was speaking for every soul who'd ever been crushed by a system bigger than themselves. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, Robert turned his fury not just on the host, but on the audience itself. His voice rose, echoing across the stage. And you don't think you're innocent either. You sit here, laughing, applauding, judging, as if I'm a character in your little drama. You don't want Robert Dyro, the man. You want Robert Dyro, the product. You want the mask. Well, guess what? The mask is gone. Gasps filled the air. The camera caught audience members with hands over their mouths, stunned into silence. For a brief second, it seemed the world had stopped spinning. And in that silence, Robert's breathing grew heavy, ragged, like a man who had just carried the weight of decades on his shoulders and finally dropped it. The host stammered, trying desperately to salvage the moment. He muttered something about taking a break, but Robert waved him off. No breaks. No more cuts. You wanted the truth, here it is. You built the circus, and I'm done playing the clown. At home, millions of viewers sat glued to their televisions. Social media erupted instantly, hashtags flooding timelines within seconds. Clips of Robert's outburst began circulating before the show had even finished airing. Some called him brave. Others said he'd lost his mind. But nobody could look away. The studio audience, sensing history unfolding before them, began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder. Some stood up, as if they were at a rally rather than a talk show taping. Robert didn't acknowledge them. His eyes were fixed forward, blazing with a fury that had finally found its release. But what makes this moment legendary isn't just Robert's eruption, it's what happened next. As the audience roared and the cameras kept rolling, Robert suddenly fell silent. His shoulders dropped. His eyes softened, filled with something even more powerful than rage, exhaustion. For the first time in his career, the world saw Robert Dyro not as a Hollywood icon, but as a man stripped bare, vulnerable, and utterly human. He sank back into his chair, his voice dropping to a whisper. I don't even know who I am anymore. And maybe that's the truth none of you want to hear. The studio fell into stunned quiet once again. No applause. No gasps. Just silence. It was as if everyone, from the producers to the viewers at home, realized they weren't watching a performance, they were watching a breakdown. And yet, it was in that silence that Robert's words carried the most weight. Because in that moment, millions of people realized he wasn't just speaking about Hollywood.
He was speaking about them.
About anyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or consumed by a world that demanded more than they could give. What happened in those final minutes of Part 2 wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It wasn't polished for the cameras. It was messy. It was painful. But it was real. And that raw reality was more powerful than any movie Robert Dyro had ever made. As the segment drew to a close, the host's voice cracked as he announced the commercial break, his hands shaking. The cameras cut to black, but the echoes of Robert's words lingered, both in the studio and across the globe. And if you think this was the peak of his eruption, you're mistaken. Because what Robert would do in Part 3 would take this story into territory nobody could have imagined. So stay with me, because if you thought Part 2 was explosive, wait until you see what comes next. The studio was no longer just a stage for light conversation. It had become a battlefield. Robert Dyro, usually the epitome of restraint, was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His eyes burned with the kind of rage you only see when years of silence and suppression finally reach their breaking point. The audience sat frozen, too shocked to clap, too afraid to breathe. Even the camera operators seemed hesitant, unsure whether to zoom in on Robert's trembling hands or keep the frame wide to capture the surreal chaos unfolding. The host, trying desperately to regain control, shuffled through his cards with nervous fingers. He forced a laugh, the kind of laugh that collapses under its own weight. Robert, let's all take a breath here. We're live, and I think maybe we've gotten a little off track. But Robert wasn't hearing him. His voice rose again, this time more cutting, more precise, as though each word had been sharpened by years of resentment. Off track? You want to talk about off track? My entire career has been off track because of people like you. Parasites who smile to my face while stabbing me in the back the second I leave the room. You don't care about the truth. You care about ratings. You care about tearing someone down because it sells ads. That's what this circus really is. A stunned murmur rippled through the audience. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, captivated by the rare sight of a man tearing down the very system he'd thrived in for decades. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like you could reach out and grab it. The host attempted damage control, his polished smile betraying cracks. Robert, no one here is trying to attack you. We're celebrating your work, your legacy. I mean, you're one of the greatest actors of our time. Robert cut him off mid-sentence, his voice booming across the stage. Don't patronize me. You think I don't see through that phony praise? You think I don't know how this works? You bring me on here, you butter me up, and then you slip in the poison. You ask the kind of questions designed to humiliate, to drag out scandals, to make me look like a fool. Well, I'm done playing your game. The words echoed like thunder. The cameras captured every furious gesture, every vein straining against his neck, every bead of sweat glistening under the hot studio lights. This wasn't just an actor losing his temper. This was a man detonating after decades of bottled-up frustration. The host glanced nervously toward the producers offstage, silently begging for direction. Should they cut to commercial? Kill the feed? But no one moved. No one dared. This was the kind of raw, unfiltered television that networks dream of, dangerous, unpredictable, unforgettable. Robert stepped closer to the host's desk, his shadow looming large under the spotlights. The audience gasped, unsure if he was about to walk out or tear the set apart with his bare hands. His voice lowered now, steadier but more chilling. You want a moment for your show? You want the clip that'll go viral? Here it is. You're looking at a man who's had enough. Enough lies. Enough exploitation. Enough pretending that this industry isn't rotten to the core. Silence blanketed the studio. You could hear the faint hum of the stage lights, the shuffle of an audience member shifting uncomfortably in their chair, even the nervous swallow of the host as he realized he had lost every ounce of control. Then, Robert did something no one expected. He turned away from the host and faced the audience directly. His voice softened, almost breaking. You cheer for us when we're on top. You worship the roles we play, the awards we win. But the second we stumble, the second we show weakness, you devour us like wolves. Do you know what it's like to be treated as less than human? To be measured not by your work, but by your mistakes. Some audience members lowered their eyes. Others nodded, visibly moved. For the first time, Robert wasn't just raging. He was confessing, pleading, exposing the deep wounds hidden beneath the mask of celebrity. The host, sensing the shift, tried to interject with a sympathetic tone. Robert, I think everyone here respects what you've done. But Robert spun back toward him, fury reigniting in an instant. Respect? Don't talk to me about respect. If there was any respect, I wouldn't be standing here having to scream just to be heard. You built your career tearing people apart. You've made millions laughing at others' pain. And you think that's respect? The crowd was torn. Some applauded, others gasped, and some just sat frozen in shock. Every word felt like a hammer smashing through the glossy veneer of television. Finally, Robert slammed his hand down on the host's desk so hard that the coffee mug rattled, nearly tipping over. The host flinched, his smile gone now, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of fear. "This is what you wanted," Robert said, voice low but unrelenting. "The truth. Not the polished version. Not the sound bites. The truth. And the truth is, I'm done with all of this. Done with pretending. Done with the lies. Done with you." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. And then, As if on cue, the studio went dead silent again. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, frozen inside that studio where one man had just shattered the carefully constructed illusion of Hollywood perfection. The question now wasn't what Robert would say next. It was what he would do. Would he storm off? Would he break down? Or would the world watch as a Hollywood legend burned every bridge live on national television? And that's when everything reached a level no one could have predicted. The studio was silent. That heavy, unnerving kind of silence, where even the air feels tense. Robert De Niro stood center stage, his chest heaving, his voice echoing in the corners of the room like a storm that had just passed but left destruction in its wake. The audience sat frozen, unsure if they should clap, leave, or just hold their breath and hope it was all part of some bizarre act. But this wasn't an act.
This was as real as it gets.
The host, still seated behind her desk, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. For years she had prided herself on breaking down Hollywood's toughest shells, on exposing the vulnerabilities of stars who usually kept their emotions hidden behind rehearsed smiles. But she had never faced a moment like this. Robert had gone beyond vulnerability. He had ripped open his soul and laid it bare for everyone to see, and in doing so, he had turned the entire show into something far bigger than an interview. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second. Somewhere in the control room, frantic producers debated whether to cut to commercial, but no one dared to push the button. This was raw. This was real. And deep down, they all knew the world had to see it. Robert took a slow step forward, his eyes no longer filled with fury but with something else, exhaustion. The kind that comes not from a bad night's sleep, but from years of carrying a burden too heavy for one man to bear. His voice, calmer now, broke the silence. "You think this is about me losing control?" he asked, scanning the crowd.
No.
This is about the truth. You want to see what's behind the curtain of Hollywood? You want to know what it's really like to live in this world you all worship? The audience leaned in, caught between fear and fascination. He raised a hand, pointing upward as though addressing the entire industry itself. They build you up only so they can tear you down. They feed off your talent, your spirit, your mistakes. Every headline, every rumor, every betrayal, it's all part of the machine. And you cheer for it. You don't even realize you're part of it. You buy the tickets, you click the stories, you fuel the gossip. And the whole time, the people behind it are laughing, counting their money while the ones in front of the cameras fall apart. Gasps scattered through the audience. Some nodded, others shook their heads, but no one looked away. This wasn't just a meltdown anymore. This was a manifesto. A declaration against everything the entertainment machine represented. The host finally spoke, her voice trembling but trying to hold its composure. "Robert, you're saying the industry destroyed you?" He turned sharply toward her, eyes piercing.
No.
The industry didn't destroy me. I destroyed myself by playing their game for too long. I let them take everything, my peace, my family, my dignity, because I thought it was worth it. I thought fame meant happiness. But all it meant was chains. The weight of those words hung in the air. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that they weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to history. Then, in a move no one could have predicted, Robert lowered himself onto the edge of the stage, sitting down as though he were just another person in the crowd. His tone softened even more, almost whispering now. "Do you know what it feels like to lose yourself? To wake up one day and realize you're not living your life. You're living the version everyone else wants to see? That's the real prison. Not the cameras. Not the contracts. The prison is forgetting who you really are." The studio was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the lights above. Some audience members wiped away tears. Others stared blankly, processing the rawness of his confession. Even the host, usually sharp-tongued and unflinching, seemed shaken. She leaned forward, her voice breaking slightly. "So, what now? What happens after this?" Robert exhaled deeply, looking around as if searching for the answer himself. Then, with a faint smile that carried both pain and relief, he said, "Now, I start over. Maybe for the first time in my life, I'll actually start living instead of performing. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply sat in stunned silence, knowing they had just witnessed something they would never forget. Robert De Niro had come onto the show as a movie star, but he was leaving as something far greater, a man who had torn off the mask in front of the entire world. And then, slowly, he rose to his feet. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam doors or shout one last insult. Instead, he gave a small nod to the audience, as if thanking them for listening, and walked calmly off stage. The cameras followed him until he disappeared into the shadows of the backstage hallway. For a long moment, no one moved. The host sat frozen, the audience stared, and the crew hesitated, unsure what to do next. Finally, the screen cut to black, leaving viewers across the country to sit in their living rooms, stunned, replaying what they had just seen. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Clips of Robert's eruption spread like wildfire, headlines filled every feed, and debates erupted on every platform. Was he brave? Was he unstable? Had he destroyed his career? Or had he just redefined it? But one thing was undeniable. Robert De Niro had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of Hollywood in front of millions, and nothing would ever be the same. Days later, interviews, articles, and endless discussions tried to dissect the moment. Some called it a breakdown, others a breakthrough. Psychologists, critics, and fellow actors all weighed in, but none of them could fully capture the gravity of what had happened. Because this wasn't about Hollywood anymore. It was about humanity. And for Robert, that night wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something entirely new. A chance to reclaim his life. A chance to find peace away from the flashing lights and relentless cameras. A chance to finally breathe. Because sometimes the most powerful performance isn't in front of a camera. Sometimes it's the courage to stop performing altogether. And that's exactly what Robert De Niro had done.